Welcome to video number 3 in the VW Mark IV transmission swap. Again, this is the 01M automatic swap to a manual. This video is about putting everything back together, and some of the things we're going to cover is getting the clutch pedal and its lines. It has 2 hydraulic lines to get done. The shift cables and getting the shifter aligned. The power steering line, we didn't take it off, but there's going to be some conflicts, and there's kind of 3 different ways to address those. And a few other things, to include programming a TDI with VCDS to now be manual in the ECU. I also want to throw out this reminder that it's at this stage, it's really exciting. Try starting it up and get going for a test drive. Once you get the axles in and everything, make sure you do a sanity check before you drive that thing out. The axle nuts. There is a specific torquing sequence to torquing your axle nuts. If you make sure that your coolant is topped back up, you will have lost some coolant messing with the coolant lines. Check the transmission that you're putting in. I have gotten them with some nasty oil in them. I have gotten them that were empty. So I recommend draining, maybe even flushing it a little bit and putting fresh gear oil in your manual transmission. Don't forget to check it at a minimum. Make sure there is some fluid in there to lubricate it. 75W90 is what's recommended. Okay, there's a small modification you need to make to your center console once you get it out of the car. There is an adapter here that we've got to take out so our new shift boot will fit in properly. It's pretty simple. Being careful because this plastic gets brittle and all the tabs break off. So be a little bit gentle with this thing. If you flip it over, when it's in automatic configuration, you'll see there's 4 little screws there. Take those 4 screws out. It's just a Phillips. They may be Torx on some cars. And there's 2 pieces that will come out. And that's the adapter for the automatic shifter. Now, your boot, your new shift boot will fit correctly. Okay, so the pedals are installed with the switches on them. Really tough filming down in here, and I haven't lubed that door yet, so it's going to squeak at us. Here's the brace that goes between the clutch and the brake pedal. And you can see there's the 1 nut on the top of the brake pedal. And then I put the brake switch back on. Over here, here's the blue switch for the cruise control, and the start safety interlock, or the clutch safety switch, the gray or white one that goes on top of the pedal. If I can get the glare, there we go. You can see the other end of that brace that I've been talking about with a 10mm nut right there in between the 2 switches. And you can see 1 of the 3 nuts there, and then there's another one on the other side there, and then there's one that I can't get a camera angle of that's up on top. And the easiest way I find to get that pedal in and tighten all those is with a really long extension on my 1/4" drive ratchet with a 10mm socket on it. Here's the shift box or the shift tower all installed. Remember, there was 2 bolts underneath that you can't see here, and then the 2 nuts to the front. I should have mentioned this before I put the shift box in. This shift box has nice bushings in it. It's pretty snug. You can see that's a new bushing right there, the 5th gear getter, I think they call that one. It's a whole lot easier putting new bushings in it while it is out of the car. So if you are thinking about putting new bushings in, do that before you install the shift box. Here's my manual transmission, almost ready to go back in. When you get your clutch kit, one of the first things to check is that your clutch plate is the right spline in the center for your transmission. It's an easy, quick check, and it's a whole lot easier doing it right now than when you're trying to hoist that transmission up in there and get it to engage. Simply slide those splines onto the input shaft to the transmission and make sure it fits on cleanly. Doesn't happen very often, but every now and then you'll get sent the wrong part, or you end up with the wrong part for whatever reason. On the clutch plate, it should say which side goes towards the gearbox. You'll notice here at the bottom it says gearbox side. There's a slight offset and it won't work backwards, so make sure you put the plate in the right way. Although this is going to mount on the engine, we're just checking fitment here right now. Before you hoist the transmission up in, put a very light coat of grease on the throwout bearing face here and on these splines. You don't want a big globs of it that will sling off and get onto the friction disc and cause your clutch to not engage well. Most clutch kits come with a little packet. Here's the one from Vallejo. But if your kit does not, Seal Glide is an excellent thing to use. Non-melting, non-freezing. It's pretty good stuff. Again, just a light coat on these splines and on the face of that throwout bearing there. Okay, this is the 6-speed, so the slave cylinder is actually in this unit here. So I've put the new slave cylinder in, torqued to spec on these 3 bolts, and I use Loctite on those 3 bolts. Here we are under the car looking at the flywheel that I just installed. Make sure you put the correct torque on those 6 bolts, and to torque them you're gonna need some kind of flywheel lock. This is a pretty cheap one. I can't remember where I got it from, but you can probably get them on Amazon. I used one of the transmission bolts and a socket to space it off the correct amount so I can crank it down tight and hold the flywheel while I get those bolts torqued. You want to go in a crisscross pattern, and if the bolt doesn't already have Loctite on it, put some Loctite on them. And when I say torque them correctly, these bolts were torqued down to 60 Newton meters and then add 90 degrees, which is very common in VWs. There's stretch bolts, you add an extra distance after you hit a certain torque spec. But looking at my torque wrench, they're about 130 Newton meters total. But you torque them by cranking it to 60 Newton meters and then an extra 90 degrees of turn. I like to mark them after I torque them. Going in a crisscross pattern, you want to make sure that you get all 6 bolts in this case. The VR6, I believe, is 10 bolts. In any case, make sure you get those all torqued correctly. Before you start hoisting the transmission up, I would clean this surface. Oftentimes, they'll come with a light coat of grease on them to keep them from rusting in packaging. A little acetone or paint thinner or something, just lightly, but you want to clean that surface off real good. Alright, looking down into the engine bay, kind of looking over everything before I get ready to hoist the transmission up. I need to remove my centering tool from the clutch plate. Again, torque to spec. In this engine it was 20 Newton meters on the 6 bolts that hold the pressure plate on, going in a crisscross pattern, and again I will recommend using a little bit of Loctite. Check the edges here that it's sitting down properly and that you are engaged on the centering pins. There's a centering pin there. I'm sorry, right here. Alright, so that's the clutch. We went through wiring extensively, so my wiring is all ready. And down in here we have the lines and the pedal. So there you can see the end of the master cylinder for the clutch, the clutch master cylinder. There are 2 lines from it. This top one That top line is the supply line right here. Getting that clamp on can be challenging. I actually use a long needle nose pliers on the clamp and then a screwdriver on the other side and work it back down on. When we're all done with the transmission hanging, we're going to cut this nipple right at where I marked it with the red line and slide the other end of that hose on. All right, this hose right here is going to come over and go on there. But we're not going to do that yet, because as soon as you cut that, you're going to have brake fluid dripping out, and even if you put that hose on, it's going to start feeding into the other line, which is the pressure line, and drip out. So we're going to leave that towards last, just so we're not having to deal with brake fluid dripping everywhere. Really hard to get a good shot down in there, but this 90-degree angle comes down, and there is a snap ring and an O-ring that hold the pressure line, and in this case it's red. They're not usually red. I have an aftermarket one. Make sure you get that engaged well and give it a little yank to make sure that it's engaged all the way. It can be deceiving and you think you get it all the way in, but then as soon as you develop pressure in the clutch, it'll pop off and you end up with fluid everywhere, which is kind of a bummer. This is the best access. It's still not great, but this is the best access you're going to get to that line while the transmission is not in. So I have that line snapped in, gave it a good check, and it's temporarily just routed out here. That red line right there is it. I put a little tape over the end of it just so I don't get it full of gunk as I'm flipping it around. And it'll lay across the top of the transmission and plug into the slave cylinder where it comes out the top of the transmission. So I got to get my flywheel lock off, and then we're ready to put the transmission in. One point that I forgot to cover previously is when you start pulling the automatic transmission out and you get the torque converter off and the backing plate, you'll find two of these shims on either side of that backing plate. Ensure that you get those out. One of them comes off with the backing plate, but the one behind it will, sometimes it's a little bit corroded and sticks to the, it's the end of the crankshaft really. So make sure you pull that off. You do not want to use those with the flywheel. Make sure you get those out. Those are only for the automatic applications. Filming the transmission coming in is next to impossible. I've tried it several times. The differential, which is the part of the transmission that sticks out the back that has the axle fittings on, are really challenging to get up past the subframe. So as the transmission comes in, you actually have to tip it forward so the differential is up and start hoisting it up, and then as soon as it clears the subframe, you can start tilting it back, and then it'll be lined up to engage with the engine. All right, so the transmission is lightly bolted up. I thought I'd show you my rig. It can be really frustrating, especially with the 6-speed is a little bit bigger and it's a little bit tighter fit. It does fit. There may be times as you're wrestling and hoisting and jacking that you think, oh, there's no way this fits in. Just be patient, keep working it. You got to play a little bit with the jack going up and down with the engine, which changes the angle of the engine. And then of course with the transmission, as you jack it up and down to match so that the splines engage, I use an extra strap. So I've got the weight of the transmission on the chains, but then I have an extra strap and sometimes even a second one out to the back here to help change that angle of the transmission to match what I have on the engine so it'll slide on and engage. It can be frustrating. Just be patient. As you're pulling and pushing and hoisting and jacking, make sure you keep checking constantly that you're not putting pressure on the hydraulic line, these water lines, or these electrical harnesses. Sometimes they can get tangled up in a chain, or you run the strap the wrong side, and when there's no tension on it, everything's fine, but as soon as you start putting tension on it, then it puts pressure. These plastic fittings break pretty easy, so if you're pushing too hard on that, they'll break. Of course, you can pull electrical too far. So be careful of that. Just take your time and keep checking all around the transmission. So a couple of ratchet straps help immensely at this point. Having an extra person goes a long way too, because sometimes all you need to do is change, either rotate the transmission a little bit or change that angle. If somebody lifts up on the bottom of the driver's side, sometimes then it'll just pop right on. I like to keep my bolts handy because it never fails that you got your arm underneath and you lift it up and it snaps into place and you're great, I got it. Oh, but I can't reach my bolts, and you have to let go of it to go get the bolts. So at least these top two, I usually start with these top two. There we go. Keep those handy so that if you do get it to pop into place, you can just grab the bolt and thread it in, and that at least will hold it in place while you find your other bolts and get going on the next one. So I've got the top two and the bottom three in. They're tight but not torqued down. So now I'm going to start working on the bracket that goes here, that goes to the transmission mount, that goes to the frame here. So I can hang the transmission by that, and then I can get this hoist out of my way, and then we'll be able to go back, torque all those bolts down to what they should be, and finish connecting everything up. Quick look, another reason I really like to have the Bentley manual is it'll tell you what your torque is for each of the three different size bolts on the transmission. Whether you have the O2J, the 5-speed, all right, some of them are 59 foot-pounds, some of them are 7 foot-pounds, and everything in between. And then, of course, as you're doing the engine mount too, you'll need those torque specs, because you want to torque those all to the correct spec. Okay, this next step is a little bit tricky, and it's routing the hydraulic line for the power steering. And there are kind of three main ways to go about it. On the automatic, that line comes from back there, and there you can see the end of it going on to the rack and pinion. Normally that comes up and routes right across the top of the transmission. It has some zigzags, which is actually a cooler, runs over to the other side and comes up and goes to the power steering pump. With the shifter mechanism, you have a conflict on both the 5-speed and on the 6-speed. So the three methods, or the three alternatives for routing that line so it doesn't interfere with your shift mechanism, is get a manual power steering line and bolt it in. Not a big deal, but you have to make sure that it's going to fit. The problem I've run into is there's a huge variation in them, and I have gotten ones that I thought were from the exact same car and they did not fit. For example, here on this power steering pump, all right, there's my line. Let me put a little light. That's where it bolts, and you can see that angle on it and that zigzag, and then it heads straight down. Okay, no big deal. But from another Jetta, here is a manual power steering line, and this angle on that line prevents it from fitting correctly. Now sometimes you can contour this hose, the rigid parts of the hose, and that can work, but in this case that's bending too far to try to put that 45-degree on it for it to lay over this way. So I opted not to use the line because I had the wrong one. But that is an option if you make sure you get the right line. Option 2 is to get a aftermarket short shifter such as the Diesel Geek, and they make a 5-speed and a 6-speed model, and that takes significantly less room. It doesn't have the big counterweight, so here's the counterweight on the 6-speed. The 5-speed kind of sticks up on an arm like that, and that is a huge interference with the power steering line. So you can just put on the Diesel Geek and still route the power steering line. It anchors into a hole right here, comes across and down, and with that Sigma 6 or Sigma 5 short shifter, there's no conflict. But those are a couple of $100, so it depends on what you want to do. So that's two options. Third option is to make the power steering line that you have work. And there's kind of two ways you can do it, and again, it kind of depends on your configuration. One technique that I have used before that worked well was still bring it up over, put a longer bolt with a spacer so it sits up high, and do a little bit of contouring on the rigid parts. Be gentle and be careful bending it, because obviously if you kink it now, it's no good. So you got to be careful, but you can recontour those a little bit, and sometimes you can get it to come up over and sit up about 4 inches higher, come across and go down, and give yourself room for that shifter. But remember, this has to come all the way over there, and this is going to flex back and forth there. Well, it comes forward a little bit further than that. So you do have to bring it up pretty high here. I couldn't get that to work on this car, so I went back to my old standby, which is routed underneath the mount, the transmission mount here. So then the fourth option, or the second of reusing your stock line, is to route it underneath the transmission mount here, which is where it's routed on the manuals. So I put a little bend here, very carefully bent that rigid line to get that line pointed out this way, came around. Oh man, this is really hard to film. Let me lay down and see if we can look up here. So here, that's my line. And you can see I got to put one more clamp on it somewhere to secure it a little bit. So it comes out from behind the transmission along the outside of the transmission. Here I got the clamp back on the starter, although I moved it on this. This is actually kind of functions as a cooler. And you want to make sure that nothing is contacting it, because of course it'll jiggle a little bit as you're driving, and the engine will move a little bit, and you don't want anything to wear a line in it, wear a hole in it. So make sure you secure wherever you can so that it's not making contact. All right, so I'm going to put one more clamp. There's a hole here for a 13mm nut that I can bring a clamp out and hold that in a little better position. So it can be frustrating, and you got to play with it and bend it a little bit here, open up that bend a little bit there. Obviously, if that piece, here we are, if that was straight, this would be a lot cleaner and a lot easier to do, but that's designed to come up over the transmission and around something and then come down the front of the transmission. So it is doable. You got to play with it. There's a bunch of options. Some of the options require parts. So kind of depends on what you want to do. I do really like the Sigma 6 shifter. Not everybody does. So, you know, or Sigma 5 if you're running a 5-speed. So take your pick, play with a little bit. Important thing is don't get in a hurry and then have an issue later on where you get a hole in your power steering line and lose your power steering. All right, next step here is installing the cables and doing the shifter alignment. The shifter alignment's fairly simple. We're going to start here in the engine bay, but then I'm going to point out a couple other things as we're going. As you are installing this bracket to hold the shifter cables, you may have to rotate this hose. I can't quite see it there. There we go. I've rotated this hose to bring it up a little bit so it doesn't rest on the edge of that bracket and wear a hole in it. So as you're going and installing stuff, keep in mind you may have to shift or reroute some things, and just look around and see what you can maybe twist so it goes a different direction. Originally that elbow there, originally that elbow there pointed downward right into the bracket, so you couldn't even put the bracket in. It's important to keep these lines from rubbing on something, because over time it'll rub through and then you'll have a leak and you will be disappointed. So put the bracket in, make sure the hose is not a conflict. Here's the 6-speed shifter. I have O2J 5-speed, will look a little different. It has the big counterweight that comes up. To align this is pretty simple. We're going to unclip the cable ends from the cable, and you do that by pulling this down and rotating it, and now the cable will slide in and out. Do that on both cables. Pull it back, and if you turn it about a quarter turn, it'll lock. So there it is, locked. Now there's an indexer on the transmission right at the first gear gate. On the 6-speed, it's that little black knob there, and on the 5-speed, it's on this side and it has a little elbow on it. So you push down to about the first gear gate and then pull or push that pin to lock this shift tower in place. Really hard to do single-handed, so I'm going to put the camera down for a moment and go ahead and lock it in place, and then we'll finish this process. If you are in neutral, the shifter will be able to go up and down, and this bushing should be centered on the slider. So I know I'm in neutral, so if I push down a little bit, I should find first gear. Sometimes you have to kind of push it up and down a little bit and feel it as you're pushing and pulling on that pin to get it to engage. Okay, so I don't know if you can tell, but that pin is shorter now than it was because it's pushed in and the shifter is locked in place. So that should be at the gate to first gear. Now we got to go inside the car and lock the shifter into the same position with a pin. Here we are looking at the shifter, and there's a hole there and then a corresponding hole down in the tower. So we're going to take a shift tool, which is simply this pin, which you can get from Diesel Geek, or in a pinch you can use a number 8 drill bit or a 13/64 drill bit. Simply push that in and then move the shifter over to the first gear gate and push it down till it engages, like so. And now the shifter is locked in the correct position. So now if we go back into the engine bay and lock the cables down. So now back in the engine bay, we can lock the cables back down. So I'm going to pull the cable a little bit, and I'm pushing with my palm just a hair, just to take a little slack out, and I'm simply going to rotate that and let it snap back on and lock the cable. Same thing on the other, which is a little harder to film. Okay, so those cables are locked in place. Now we pull this pin back out. Okay, it's still locked, so don't try to push the shifter around. And we go back inside. And we pull that pin out, and we should be aligned with our gears. So that should be first, second, third, fourth, push it to the right, fifth, sixth, feels pretty good, and then push it down, over, and that should be reverse. Now it's hard to tell without the car running, so I would recommend that you check it very carefully once you have the car started up and verify that those are all the correct gears, because you really can't tell right now if that is reverse or first. If you're really used to the transmissions, you can look at the shifter and tell. Here, we'll put it on reverse, push down, past the gate. Looking at how low that shifter is, that is reverse. So I'm 99% sure we got it right. But again, check very carefully the first time so you don't drive into your toolbox or the wall of your shop or garage or what have you. Sometimes you have to do it a couple of times and it will be really close and it kind of ratchety to go into a gear. Try pulling the slack out or in as you pop that spring, and that little bit of slop sometimes will clean it up and so you can make it fit just perfect. But 2 or 3 times you ought to have it just perfect, and then you are set on your shifter. The next step we're getting ready to do is bleed the clutch. So I snip the nipple off and quick flip that hose on there before all the brake fluid drained out. Put the clamp on, and my hose is engaged, and I gave it a little tug to make sure it's secure with the clips. I lubricated the little O-ring on the tip of the hose before I shoved it in there so it would go in nicely. On the 6-speed, under this little cap, is a bleed screw, and that's what we're going to use here. My favorite technique is with a pressure bleeder. They're $60 or $70 on Amazon or from FCP Euro or one of those type places. There are several models. Worth it. If you're ever going to bleed your own brakes, it's worth it, especially for bleeding this 6-speed. It's the only way I've been able to make them really work. It's a pretty simple process. You fill with fluid, put the lid on your master cylinder, pump it up to 10 psi or so, put a bleed hose on the bleeder screw on your clutch, and then open that. In this case, it's a 9mm, and let all the bubbles flow out till you get nice even fluid. As I mentioned before, the 6-speed is a little more tricky because of the shape of it, and the slave cylinder is actually down in the transmission. So sometimes you have to bleed it real well and then let it sit for a couple hours, and any residual bubbles that are down in the slave cylinder will gravitate up, and then when you bleed it again, you'll get them. I have bled them 3 or 4 times before and had a little bit of trouble. So be patient. Bleed it till you don't see any bubbles, then let it sit for a little bit, and then bleed it again. Sometimes I'll just let it sit overnight and then finish it in the morning. So bleeding is fairly easy. Again, with the 6-speed, the bleed screw is right here. On the 5-speed, this shift tower is actually over a little bit, and I believe the bleed screw is about here. Here is a slave cylinder. Obviously, this is an old one from a 5-speed. So if you're working with a 5-speed instead of a 6-speed, this, where the orange earplug is where your line comes in from the master cylinder on the clutch pedal. And this is your bleed screw. So these bleed a little bit easier than the 6-speeds. And this mounts sort of underneath right about there. So your line from the brake pedal, clutch pedal will come up through here and in. Just so you get a look at the slave cylinder for a 5-speed. This flange right here bolts onto the top of the transmission. This sticks in and hits the actuator arm or the clutch arm. Again, if you get all done, you sit down in the car and you push the clutch in and it engages really, really low, or it just flips straight to the firewall, just bleed the clutch again. Now you can bleed this manually by opening and closing the bleed screw there and somebody pushing and pulling on the pedal in the car, just like the old style of doing brakes, but that can take you a really, really long time and you will go through a lot of brake fluid. If you're doing it that way, remember to keep filling up your master cylinder as you're bleeding fluid out. Another technique I have heard of, but I have not tried, and one of these days I will, but I just don't have time right now, is to actually use the brake to bleed the clutch in reverse. I can't verify how well it works, but I have heard people say it's the only way to do it. You need a piece of hose of long enough, that's long enough, and you route it from the bleed screw down underneath the transmission mount, down to the bleed screw on the left front brake. Open both bleed screws, and then you pump the brake. And as you pump the brake, it will push fluid up through that hose, down in, and through the system backwards. My concern on a 6-speed is that that T there actually goes down and into the transmission, and I believe that the pressure will just be sending the fluid back up the line, so you'll bleed that line very well. On the 5-speed, it may work really well because that bleed screw is closer to the actual slave cylinder. Again, haven't tried it, don't know, but sounds like it might be a good idea. One of these days I'm going to try it and verify it, and then we'll video it. So that's bleeding the clutch. All right, for you TDI or ALH guys, this is how you recode the ECU to think that the car is now a manual. So here I am in VCDS. Obviously it's plugged in, and I already went through a full scan and delete. Sometimes it won't accept the coding if there are certain malfunctions. So clear all your fault codes, and then you go into engine. Here we are going into engine, and you have to log in for it to let you do any coding once it reads and fills out all your data. All right, there's all the data. So now I click on login, which is button 11. Now this looks scary, but once you move the cursor, this will come up, and the 12233 is the code that you need here for logging in. So you just click on the box. Oops, I gotta take the zeros out. So 12233, and click do it. All right, so now we can log into coding, box 7, and it's really simple. It gives you the cheat sheet there. So if it's 4 zeros and a 1, that's an automatic transition. 4 zeros and a 2 is the manual transmission front wheel drive with crash shutoff, which is the US spec. Right, we didn't get the all-wheel drive. All of the US have the crash shutoff. I'm not sure what that one is, or that one. So all we're going to do is put in quad 02 for our code, and then click do it and save. So we're going to close this that's blocking this little dialog box. All right, so in here, 4 zeros and a 2. So you can either just backspace out the 1 and put in a 2, or you can delete the whole thing. So now I'm going to go into do it. Sometimes it'll ask you, are you sure? And you click yes. Okay, I'm going to close out of the controller and then go back into it and make sure it's saved. Every now and then it doesn't save. Like I said, if there's a fault code, certain fault codes will keep you from recoding. So we're just going to go back into engine now and double check that it reads. Now on the gassers, it'll let you go through this process, but it'll never save correctly. All right, so it's saved. Oh, let me close that dialog box. So there you can see the 2, so it did save correctly. With the gas engines, I've tried it and tried it and tried it. It won't save. You have to EEPROM code it. It looks like you can do it, and I got all excited when I went through it, but it doesn't work on the gassers, so this is for TDIs only. Back from the test drive, everything worked like a champ. The 6-speed is so nice in this TDI. In 6th gear at 80, not saying I was doing 80, but if I was, it would have been clicking over at about 2,400 RPM, which is really nice on the interstate in a TDI. Cruise control works like a champ. Backup lights are working. Cruise control turns off when you push in the clutch. The car will not start with the clutch out, will start with the clutch in. So all of our wiring worked out beautifully. So another Mark IV saved from the junkyard. She's still got a lot of life left in her, and now she drives really nicely. So again, thanks for watching. This concludes our 01M automatic to manual swap in the Mark IVs. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us for that journey. Please like and subscribe. I can use all the support I can get so I can keep making these videos.